Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're untangling the incredibly complex global dominoes that fell between 1918 and 1939. You know, when we think of the Second World War, we almost always picture those massive armies clashing in the 1940s. But to truly understand how the entire globe plunged into such devastating chaos, we have to rewind. So, what really started World War II? We often think of it as this sudden, out-of-nowhere explosion in 1939, but actually, it was a slow-burning fire. Yes, on September 1st, 1939, German troops thrust deep into Poland, but the roots of that invasion were planted barely 20 years earlier. Think about it. The defeated German army of 1918 marched home harboring a really dangerous myth. They genuinely believed they hadn't been defeated in battle, but rather betrayed by cowardly politicians. And that simmering, deep-seated resentment, that's where our story truly begins. Here is how we'll break it down today. Section 1, a flawed peace. 2, Japan makes its move. 3, Mussolini and the League. 4, the Spanish testing ground. And finally, Section 5, Germany's march to war. Okay, let's jump into Section 1, a flawed peace, the bitter seeds of Versailles. It's crazy to think about, but the well-intentioned peace at the end of World War I actually planted a ticking time bomb. The map of Europe was entirely redrawn. Centuries-old empires were just dismantled, and brand new nations like Czechoslovakia and Poland were born. But as you can imagine, not everyone was celebrating. You can trace this rapid succession of disasters right from the start. Right after the Versailles Treaty, the new democratic Weimar Republic in Germany was struck by extreme instability. I mean, by 1923, hyperinflation literally wiped out the life savings of everyday ordinary people. And just as things kind of started to stabilize slightly, boom, the 1929 Wall Street crash threw the entire globe into a massive, severe economic depression. But the absolute crucial breaking point? A staggering financial punishment. £6.6 billion in reparations. Try to wrap your head around that number. It was the ultimate indignity for the German people. They were already facing starvation and rampant political violence in the streets, and now they were being forced to pay a sum the war-torn nation simply mathematically could not afford. And following that 1929 U.S. stock market crash, utter desperation took hold. The result? 6 million Germans entirely out of work. 6 million. This created unbelievably fertile ground for a radical, rabble-rousing politician named Adolf Hitler to step in and offer extreme solutions. Suddenly, extremist parties looked incredibly appealing to a desperate public. Hitler, using this fiery, captivating oratory, blamed Germany's ills on the Jews and promised to rebuild the nation's strength and seize new territories in the East. Moving on to Section 2, Japan makes its move. The first cracks in global security. So, while Europe was seriously struggling, an exploding population and a severe lack of natural resources forced a military power over in the Pacific to look outward. Japan was already an acknowledged world power after World War I, right? But its rapidly expanding industries desperately needed raw materials, stuff like grain, coal, and minerals, that they just didn't have at home. This whole era was defined by a terrifying contrast: bold, unchecked aggression meeting completely paralyzed, distracted democracies. While America was, frankly, lost in the Jazz Age and then crippled by the Great Depression, Japan made its move. In 1931, the Japanese army seized Chinese Manchuria. And get this, they didn't even tell their own elected government first. And when the League of Nations condemned them, Japan literally just walked out. The human cost of this unchecked aggression became horrifyingly clear in 1937. Japanese forces intentionally provoked a wider war, fighting with exceptional brutality and bombing cities completely indiscriminately. It's absolutely heartbreaking. An estimated 300,000 civilians were massacred in Nanking during a horrific 6-week period. And the crazy part? Even when their own gunboats were sunk, like the USS Panay, where 50 American sailors tragically died, the traumatized Western powers straight up refused to fight. They left China to stand completely alone. President Roosevelt actually wanted to impose a naval blockade, but Britain was just too terrified of provoking a wider war. So all those great, lofty promises to stop international aggression, they fell completely flat. Section 3, Mussolini and the League. Fascism finds a role model. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Benito Mussolini had taken power in Italy amidst massive social unrest. He'd organized his fascist party and just ruthlessly eliminated all opposition. And he was watching Japan get away with invasion, thinking, you know what, I'm going to carve out a new Roman Empire. This really highlights a terrifying reality. The great international institution designed specifically to prevent war was entirely powerless. When Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935, the emperor appealed directly to the League of Nations. And even when Italy dropped poison gas bombs, which was a direct, undeniable violation of international law, the League did absolutely nothing but wring its hands and impose these totally useless economic sanctions. And you better believe Hitler was taking notes. He saw a fascist system successfully building modern air forces and massive public works, while democracies like Britain and France were just drowning in mass unemployment and the lingering trauma of the First World War. They simply had zero stomach for a fight. Let's look at Section 4, the Spanish Testing Ground, a rehearsal for global conflict. In 1936, this exceptionally vicious civil war broke out in Spain. You had a left-wing republic being challenged by a right-wing military coup led by General Francisco Franco. Now, this civil war incredibly quickly escalated into a proxy war. Hitler explicitly used it to test out his brand-new, modern military equipment on an actual battlefield. He eagerly supplied the Luftwaffe to airlift Franco's troops. Soon enough, German panzer tanks and Italian aircraft were just pouring in. Stalin, fearing the rise of fascism, actually sent Soviet military advisors and tanks to help the Republic. But conspicuously missing from this entire battlefield, the Western democracies. While thousands of innocent civilians died in indiscriminate bombings, Britain and France clung desperately to peace by essentially closing their eyes. They cynically declared a policy of non-intervention. The brutal destruction of the Basque town of Guernica, which resulted in 6,000 civilian deaths, proved definitively to Hitler and Mussolini that terror tactics absolutely worked. And worse, it proved that the democratic powers would do absolutely nothing to stop them. Which brings us to Section 5, Germany's march to war. The dominoes fall. Facing all these compounding failures, France woke up and realized it just couldn't compete with Germany's sheer manpower. Because of a declining birth rate and profound lingering trauma from World War I, the French military adopted an entirely defensive mindset. They poured an unbelievable amount of resources into the Maginot Line, essentially hiding behind a giant wall. It was a strict posture that completely crippled their ability to intervene anywhere else. And this was a fatal tactical mismatch. While a traumatized France dug into these static, immobile fortresses, aggressive dictatorships were preparing for lightning-fast movement. They were combining tanks, infantry, and aircraft to thrust fast and deep into enemy territory. It was a totally different way of looking at war. Hitler's ultimate ambition, which he actually outlined years earlier in his book Mein Kampf, was to ruthlessly conquer territory in the East. And his expansion accelerated like stepping stones. First, he claimed back the Saarland and the demilitarized Rhineland. Then, he pulled off a bloodless invasion to annex his homeland of Austria. Next, he set his sights on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, blatantly threatening force if his demands weren't met. And he was realizing every single step of the way that the democracies simply were not going to push back. In a totally desperate bid for peace, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich. He acted as a peacemaker and, incredibly, literally handed Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for a simple piece of paper. A piece of paper where Hitler pinky promised he had no more territorial ambitions. It proved to both Hitler and Mussolini, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the democracies were hopelessly weak. Unsurprisingly, barely 6 months after Munich, Hitler annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Then he demanded the Polish port of Danzig. Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand, promising to defend Poland. But at that point, Hitler simply did not care. When the shocking secret non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union was announced in August 1939, basically splitting Poland between them, Hitler's path was totally clear. On September 1st, 1939, the German armed forces invaded. So I leave you with this to ponder. If the Western democracies had stood up to that early aggression, could the deadliest conflict in human history have been prevented? It's a tragic irony, really. The road to war wasn't paved in a single day, but brick by brick over 2 decades of inaction, economic desperation, and appeasement. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the past.